What's up, guys? We're going to take a look at a brand new Masters of the Universe Classics figure today. We have got Quakke in the new Super7 line for Motu Classics. This guy comes from the New Adventures of He-Man. I have a bit of a soft spot for that show and for that property, so I am really excited to actually get him out of the box and see what he has to offer. He just looks pretty wild at first glance. We've got the same kind of packaging that we're used to in the line, so just like Super7 had mentioned, they are not changing this up. You know, for your inbox collectors out there who want some consistency among the line. What we do have that is new, well, not new, but reborn, I guess, are bios on the card back. So we get new updated bios for the figure. We've got the 8 figures that are currently out in Wave 1 of Classics and Wave 1 of Filmations. So yeah, I am very excited to pull this guy out, so let's get him out and take a look. Alright guys, so here is our Quakke figure out of the packaging, and I gotta say right off the bat I am pretty excited to get this guy onto my shelf with some other New Adventures of He-Man figures, and I really do think that he has such a weird and quirky design that it works really, really well in this new Motu Classic style. Definitely a homage to the original figure. In many ways, he is very, very similar to his vintage counterpart, just kind of upscaled for this new, larger line with, you know, added benefits of having mostly modern articulation. So we're going to go over just the normal stuff. We'll look at paint, sculpt, and all that stuff. We'll look at this enormous accessory, because if there's one place I think this figure has an issue, it's right here. And then we'll do a comparison against the original figure. I don't have an out-of-box sample, but we do have a carded figure that will show pretty much exactly what we need. So as far as articulation on this guy goes, you're looking at your standard Motu Classics figure, although there are a few hindrances here and there just because of his design and his armor, things like that. So we're going to start at the head and work our way down, obviously. Head can swivel. He has a little bit of up and some down. So I've had some issues with the up and down movement on my figures from Super7 so far, specifically the PowerCon figures, and by comparison this is very different. He can actually look down, whereas those PowerCon figures had the ability to, they never stayed down, which was my issue at the time. Arms can go out, and he does have armor that is attached, and we'll talk about that shortly. Arms can go out and then they will rotate, but this one in particular, it's attached to the forearm. The shoulder is attached to the forearm, so that's going to present some issues. This one as well, it can swivel all the way around, just like that. And it's fine. This piece is you know, soft, rubbery plastic. It'll move. It'll give you some room to breathe there. We've got our bicep cut. We have got single jointed elbow, as is the norm for this line, and then we've got rotating wrists. He has a waist twist. He does have a crunch, but it's underneath the armor, so it might as well not even be there. He can look forward a little bit, but that's about it, and it's very minimal. It's almost non-existent, and he really doesn't want to stay there either because the armor wants him in a certain way. Even though it's flexible, it's still a big enough piece to kind of hinder his movement. Legs can go all the way out. There's nothing stopping him there, so you could have your Quakke doing splits if you want. Pretty good forward kick. The leg's going to start to hit the crotch piece and then back a little bit. We've got thigh cut. We've got single jointed knees, so you know what to expect there if you've bought any Motu Classics. We got a boot cut, and then we have hinged ankles. There is a little bit of wobble here, but it's not a rocker. It's just you know, kind of a wobbly peg basically. So he's mostly just a hinged ankle like we've come to expect with this line. Now as far as the sculpt on this guy goes, I think, you know, being that Motu Classics are, at least in this instance, is a modern interpretation of a vintage toy, this is pretty spot on. This looks really, really good and really close to what the vintage Quakke looks like. It's got the kind of wacky facial expression, because he had a weird look on his face in the package. In that vintage toy, he's got the cracked armor all over the place, and then you know, just the varying plates that are all over the body, not to mention the more mechanical aspect of the back of the figure, and everything's just sort of riveted and held together. You know, it's got kind of like that seismic look, because that's, you know, that's his ability. His name is Quakke for a reason, so he very much looks like he is kind of broken and cracked and everything's kind of stitched together. What I have an issue with in a slight way, it's not a really a big deal, it's just something to point out, is in terms of the the arms. So you can see we've got the gold underneath there. I think this is kind of an odd design element. It looks funny to me. Because in the vintage toy, it's just his shoulder is a plate. It's kind of like this piece right here. There's nothing underneath it that you can really see. So it's odd to go from a gold shoulder piece to a red arm. It looks, it just doesn't look right to me. It doesn't flow very well, I guess is a good way to say that. It's not in any way off-putting to me. It's just something I keep seeing. Of course, there is this humongous piece of armor that is sitting over top of the buck. That's where a ton of our sculpted detail is. I mean, obviously, tons of paintwork in there, and it does not appear to be removable. It looks like the sides, let me raise that arm, these pieces, this appears to be glued together. I started to move it just to see how it would work, and it didn't look like it really wanted to move, so I didn't press it any further. It is, of course, connected to these shoulder pieces. They are glued on by the look of it. I don't see them wanting to move. And then this piece is obviously, as I mentioned before, connected to the forearm, and it's glued on there as well. So even if you were able to remove this, all of this is still connected, actually glued onto the arm there. He has a black buck underneath. I don't know if you can really see that. It's just a black buck, so nothing too crazy there. But it is worth noting that as far as I can tell, the armor piece, while yes, it does have that removable look, and those you can see the little pegs that are in there, which are pretty standard for Motu Classics, they don't really appear to be removable, and you'd have one really goofy looking figure if you removed it anyway. So take that for what it's worth. I think head sculpt wise, I think he is pretty spot on. The expression on his face is very close to what's on the vintage toy. It's slightly different here, but that's okay. And then it's still got that rocky, kind of cracked armor look appearance going on with his helmet. He does kind of look like he has a bit of a wonky eye situation going on. I don't think that that is a problem. I think that is an interpretation of the vintage toy, because the vintage toy also kind of looked weird. Everything was slightly askew. He's kind of he's a weird character, and I think that's part of the design, and I don't have an issue with it. So if you think you're seeing a wonky eye, you kind of are, but I think it might be somewhat intentional, and it's just based on the design and what I know from the vintage action figure. So that's just my interpretation of it, and your mileage may vary on that. Now, as far as paint on this guy goes, obviously he's got a lot of varying colors. We have got the kind of Richter scale type graph going on his chest, which I think is a really fun and cool design. We've got a lot of different colors in general. There's silvers and grays and blacks and golds, tons of gold, and I'm really digging the overall appearance of the gold armor and then the silver armor. And there is a wash on the back to give it a little bit of a dirty look, and it's just kind of applied kind of willy-nilly on the back. It's not a whole lot on the front. It's mostly down here on the abdomen area. But I think he looks pretty good. There's a lot going on with this armor. It's very well detailed, a lot of rivets, a lot of screws, because like I mentioned, he's been cracked and then stitched back together. So I just dig the aesthetic here. Again, I'm partial to this figure and this character and this series, but I think they really nailed the overall look of Quake. This is, as far as I'm concerned, this is the best modern Quake I think we could have gotten. Okay, let's talk accessories. So this is a very, very faithful recreation of the vintage Quake action figures accessory, the Grabatron Meteor mace. That is a mouthful. So the mace is this part. We've got the three-pronged mace, and then this is a meteor up here on the top. Basically, the whole shtick in the vintage line was that you would press a lever on his back, and he would slam it down, and the meteor would crack. And they've tried to replicate it, and I think what they're doing in terms of this line, I think it works out pretty well. My issue with this is that it's kind of hard to utilize. The actual utility aspect of it is pretty hard. So he is sculpted in such a way that he can hold it basically in two hands only, because it is so heavy. This hand is meant to grasp the actual handle. This hand is sculpted to grasp the wider kind of stock of the staff. He can't hold it so that it rests on the ground in one hand, and it's so top heavy that it's really, really hard to get him to hold it in just one hand. So the way this works is that it's a three-pronged staff. Let me pull that off. And you can see there are just three prongs on there, and they don't seem to be keyed in any certain way, but I actually find that I can only really put this on in certain ways, which is kind of odd. But the staff in general, I think, is sculpted really well. It is kind of cumbersome and kind of unwieldy, which is part of the problem, but it is what it is. It's supposed to be big, and it's a humongous weapon. I think it's sculpted well. I think it's got some nice paint apps on it. From that aspect, I think they did a great job. The actual Meteor portion is, it's 2 halves of plastic, and it's actually very heavy. It's heavier than just about anything else on this figure. I mean, it's very very hefty, and it's got 3 holes. So each prong will go into one of those holes, and if you were to slam it on the ground like that, it'll crack open, and it shows you the inside of this kind of like seismic meteor. And there's a lot of paint in there, some silvers and blues and blacks and golds. So they went to some trouble to actually get this thing painted. The problem, again, is that it only goes back together one way as well, is that it has to rest on here. There's no kind of locking mechanism. It doesn't really lock into place. It seems like it wants to, but it doesn't really. It just sort of fits in there rather snug. But over time, I worry that he's just going to lose his balance and he's going to fall over with it. I think it's pretty cool from a design standpoint. It's a weird, wacky, goofy weapon, and it matches the goofy character. But it's really, really hard to actually pose him sometimes, especially when I've been trying to pose him in kind of a slamming motion where he's actually bringing the hammer down. It's just kind of rough. You'll have to work with it. I assume I'm going to have to pose him in a rather neutral pose with this. Maybe not even on the staff. I think he looks pretty cool like this, honestly. But maybe with the Meteor on the ground or something. And like I mentioned, just for a quick comparison's sake, here is our new Quake with our old Quake. And you can see there's some very, very similar styles going on here. We've got, his Meteor mace with the broken meteor. He's got the purple pants. He's got the slightly gold shoulders and legs. He's got the silver chest. He's got that Richter type graph chart on his chest, and he's got that wacky, goofy expression with the rather offset eyes. So I think they did an excellent job in trying to replicate this figure in a more modern scale. I mean, I love my original Quake, and I'm really happy to have him, but this thing is, all the issues with the mace aside, he just looks awesome, and he looks like the exact modern upscaled version of this vintage figure. So at the end of the day, this figure it's not perfect, and it does have some issues. The design issues that I mentioned are very, very nitpicky, I think. His overall aesthetic, his sculpt, his paint, I think is rock solid, no pun intended. He just looks really, really cool. Again, I am very partial to this character, but I think based on the original figure, it's hard to deny that this is a very well faithfully redone modern interpretation of Quake. That mace does have its issues, and I will have to play around with it to get that thing to do what I want it to do, but they did, stick true to the kind of the thing for Motu Classics where they replicate that vintage action feature as best they can without having an action feature. The only real thing I could have hoped for is that the rock or the meteor would have been lighter. That's really would have saved this accessory, I think. But overall, I am very pleased with him, and I think he just is going to look fantastic with some other New Adventures Space Mutants. So that is going to do it for this look at the Masters of the Universe Classics Quake figure from Super 7. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. And until next time, guys.